I learned in steel-toed silence that competence without sponsorship looked like guilt from across a polished table. The lesson arrived on the 32nd floor of Aegis Aeronautics, under fluorescent panels that made every face look flatter and every lie look procedural. By 9 that morning, the live incident review for the Bay 3 shutdown had drawn defense clients, executive leadership, compliance counsel, and 2 auditors who never looked up from their binders unless somebody said the words chain of custody. I stood at the left end of the conference room, one hand on the display console I had configured myself, waiting for my name to be called from the speaker roster. My badge still read Incident Lead. My notes were indexed by minute. My throat felt steady. Then Nolan Price looked at me in front of 40 people and said, "Sit down, Harper. Real safety leads prevent shutdown events. They do not cause them." He did not raise his voice. That was his method. He preferred a quiet correction, the kind that sounded managerial and landed like a verdict. A few people shifted in their seats, not from shock, but from relief that hierarchy had been clarified for them. Someone near legal gave a short nod and wrote something down as if a dispute had already been resolved. Nolan kept one palm on the table, the other on the tablet controlling the room feed, and continued as though he had merely announced an agenda item. "We will proceed with revised speakers. Ms. Lewis will support documentation as needed." The central monitor flickered once. My name disappeared from the active list. The moment took less than 6 seconds and erased 6 years. I sat. I did not protest my removal, did not ask for procedural grounds, did not throw credentials onto the table, and demand to be recognized in real time. I pulled my notebook toward me and wrote the first line at 9:14:22. Price states causation before evidence review. I wrote the second line at 9:14:41. Speaker roster altered mid-session. I wrote the third line at 9:15:03. Incident lead reassigned without vote. Ink gave me structure when language in that room had been repurposed as theatre. The glass wall at my back reflected the room in reverse, a silent duplicate where everyone appeared to face me while no one truly did. Through the reflection, I watched Nolan begin his summary of Bay 3 as if the system had failed on its own and as if I had not written the lockout protocol that had prevented a fatal cascade. The core wound was older than that morning, but that morning named it with precision. I had spent years learning that in corporate risk culture, capability was not the highest currency. Sponsorship was, visibility was, the right man narrating your work before clients was. My reports had lowered incident rates across 2 production lines, yet in quarterly briefings, Nolan introduced me as support. I wrote the near-miss matrices and he presented the trend lines. I negotiated line stoppage thresholds with operations, and he called them team adjustments. He never had to steal loudly. He only had to stand in the right place when credit entered the room. I stayed calm because that was what disciplined people did, and each time I stayed calm, the room learned to treat my calm as consent. 3 years earlier, during my first client walkthrough at Aegis, I had corrected a hazardous sequencing error in Bay 2 before a turbine test. The floor supervisor thanked Nolan by name while I stood 2 feet away in hearing range, still wearing the static wrist strap from the line. Nolan clapped me lightly on the shoulder and said, "Harper keeps the binders immaculate." The client laughed politely and asked him whether he had built the safety spine personally. He answered yes without using the word yes. I remember that exchange because of the smell in that corridor, warm hydraulic oil and fresh paint, and because I understood for the first time that truth did not travel on merit alone. It travelled on rank, voice, and who the room already expected to be right. At 9:22 in the conference review, Nolan advanced to a slide titled Human Error Pathway. My employee ID appeared in the top right corner beneath the words preliminary attribution. He narrated each bullet with legal caution and social confidence, describing deviations that had not occurred and omissions that had been mine, only in the sense that he had overwritten the alert pathway months earlier. A vice president across from him asked, "Do we have consensus on immediate accountability?" Nolan answered before counsel could speak. "We do. Ms. Lewis has accepted that her judgment during restart conditions was not aligned with protocol." He did not look at me when he said, "Accepted." He did not need to. In that room, syntax carried authority. If a supervisor used past tense and a complete sentence, many people treated it as evidence. I wrote another timestamp. 9:22:48. False statement of admission. No one defended me. Not legal, not operations, not the executives who had signed my annual performance citations with phrases like exceptional technical rigor. They watched me in the manner institutions watch a person they are preparing to classify. There is a particular silence that arrives when colleagues decide your reputational value is lower than their comfort. It is not dramatic. It is administrative. Chairs settle, pens move, eyes return to the person with the microphone. I felt the old reflex rise in me, the need to explain each point line by line until reason restored itself. I did not indulge it. Fragmented defense is a gift to a practiced narrator. He can interrupt, reframe, and reduce. I had seen Nolan do it to vendors, junior engineers, and one former manager who left 2 weeks after being corrected in front of procurement. The humiliation itself was not new. The setting made it surgical. This was not an argument at a loading dock or a harsh remark in a hallway. This was a prestige room with client lanyards, counsel present, and a live feed to 2 satellite offices. The table surface held polished brass speaker tags, each one angled toward external observers, each one announcing who counted. Mine had been removed before the session started. In its place sat a blank card. I noticed because details were how I survived systems designed to blur accountability. I noticed the pause before Nolan said my name, the way he emphasized real safety leads as if the category excluded me by natural law, the way one auditor glanced at me only after he spoke, calibrating his expression to the room's cue. People call moments like that politics. I called it controlled erasure. By the second week after the shutdown, I had replayed that morning often enough to strip it of drama and retain only sequence. Sequence mattered. Sequence is where claims either anchor or dissolve. Bay 3 had been listed as camera compromised for months due to a maintenance ticket Nolan had signed as deferred. That fact would have made any direct testimony from me vulnerable to dismissal. Yet the architecture in Bay 3 had never truly gone dark because I had installed a mirrored redundancy patch after 2 near-miss reports vanished from primary archives. I had documented the patch in compliance notes that Nolan had labelled non-essential background and buried under revision comments. I didn't say any of this in the meeting. I wrote timestamps and let him build his narrative to full height. At 9:31, counsel requested a 10-minute recess. People stood in clusters by function rather than conscience, legal at the far credenza, operations near the glass, executives around Nolan, as if authority generated warmth. I remained seated, turning pages in my notebook, checking that each entry included a minute marker and direct quote. A junior analyst approached, held out a revised agenda, and said, "You are no longer listed for verbal response." Her tone carried apology and habit in equal parts. "Understood," I said. She hesitated long enough to whisper, "They are trying to close this before procurement reconvenes." Then she returned to her group before anyone could notice she had stopped by my chair. I looked through the glass at the city, steel and rain and traffic lines folding into one another, and felt the old pressure to ask for fairness die a useful death. Fairness was not a procedure at Aegis unless evidence forced it to be. I had wanted for years to be recognised by the people nearest to me in the org chart, the people who watched me build systems and still called me support. That hunger had made me patient in the wrong direction. Silence was not peace. It was surrender when it served someone else's script. It became discipline only when tethered to a plan. When the meeting resumed, Nolan invited final comments from leadership and spoke of corrective culture in the same tone he had used to erase me. I let him finish. I watched him conclude that Bay 3 had failed because protocol ownership had been mishandled at the lead level. I wrote his final line at 9:47:11. Then I closed my notebook, not as resignation but as commitment. I would not fight for belief in that room, not that hour, not on terms he controlled. I would establish record, custody, and sequence. I would submit what could be authenticated independent of personality, volume, or favour. My name is Harper Lewis, and that was the morning I stopped asking powerful men to describe me accurately and started requiring the record to speak for itself. The last line of my vow was still warm in my chest when Nolan tapped the table twice and said, "One more item before we break." Half the room had already risen, folders tucked under arms, client badges flashing silver against dark jackets. They settled again because he was still holding the room feed remote, and at Aegis the person who controlled the screen controlled the moment. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, steady and indifferent, while he moved to the centre position I had occupied in every drill review for the previous 18 months. He looked at me only long enough to make the next instruction land publicly. "Ms. Lewis, stand by the glass. We need clear access around the console." I stood. I moved to the wall. No one offered me a chair this time. Nolan shifted to a slide he had not shown during the formal review, a simplified timeline with red bars across the bottom and my initials stamped beside each one. It was a visual built for speed and blame, clean enough to survive a screenshot, blunt enough to travel into procurement chatter before noon. He spoke in that careful executive cadence that made fiction sound procedural. "For our partners in attendance, we have contained the variable. Root cause ownership has been assigned, remediation is underway, and operational leadership remains stable." Then he added, with a faint glance in my direction, "Documentation support will continue under supervision." One defense client at the far end asked, "Is she still authorized on incident systems?" Nolan did not hesitate. "Not for active command entries." He let that sentence breathe. The room accepted it as fact because he delivered it before anyone thought to verify scope, and because the badge on my jacket still gave him plausible deniability. He turned to the compliance coordinator and said, "Please update floor access in real time." The coordinator looked at me, then at him, and typed. A soft notification sounded from somewhere near legal. My phone vibrated once in my pocket. Access revision pending. A vice president I had briefed weekly for a year leaned back and folded his hands. "Good. We need a single voice." He meant Nolan. Everyone knew he meant Nolan. The polished table reflected their faces like a second audience looking up from below. Then came the line he had prepared for memory. "We cannot let individual judgment compromise program credibility again." He did not raise his volume. He sharpened his diction. Program credibility, individual judgment. He gave the room terms that protected everyone with power and isolated the one person already displaced from the roster. A junior engineer near the door glanced at me, then down at his shoes, then back to Nolan, as if he had chosen the safer gravity. I felt heat climb behind my ribs, not dramatic, not explosive, just a concentrated pressure that wanted language. I wanted to ask him which individual judgment he meant, mine when I forced Bay 3 into shutdown under red status, or his when he instructed operations to keep output moving through an interlock warning 2 months earlier. I wanted to put his own emails on the monitor and let every timestamp sit beside his voice. I did not move. I watched his right index finger rest on the remote, the same finger that had cancelled my speaking slot, and I kept my hands still at my sides until the impulse to answer passed from flame to iron. By 10:05, the room had thinned to internal leadership, counsel, and 2 auditors who stayed because hearings required minutes and minutes required witnesses. Nolan pivoted to immediate controls, assigning tasks I had authored last winter and presenting them as emergency inventions. He spoke my work without my name, which had always been his most efficient technique. Then, with clinical politeness, he looked toward me and said, "Harper, you may circulate revised forms by end of day. Do not issue technical interpretations. Route through me." The legal associate nearest him asked, "For the record, is this a temporary reporting adjustment?" Nolan said, "Indefinite, pending performance review." Silence followed. Not shocked silence, administrative silence. People writing that phrase into their own versions of what had happened. Indefinite. Pending. Performance. The language of doors closing without noise. I wrote each sentence into my notebook from memory before we even left the room. Because phrasing becomes architecture in investigations, and architecture decides which truths remain standing. When Nolan dismissed us, he held the door and thanked the clients by name. I was the only person who left without acknowledgement. Outside, the corridor smelled like printer heat and floor polish. Glass offices lined one side, the city on the other, rain threading down the windows in strict vertical lines. At the access station by the elevators, my badge flashed amber instead of green. The guard read his tablet, then read it again, uncomfortable with the mismatch between my title and his instruction. "Ms. Lewis, incident floor permissions are suspended. Conference and admin zones only." He lowered his voice. "I'm required to keep your credential lanyard for reissue." I unclipped the red incident tab and handed it to him. The plastic clicked against his counter like a small bone. Nolan arrived 2 steps behind me with operations and HR. He smiled as though we were finishing a normal handoff. "Thank you for your cooperation," he said. "This helps us protect you while we stabilize the narrative." Not stabilize operations. Stabilize the narrative. He said it in front of 3 employees and a uniformed visitor from procurement, then turned to HR. "Please prepare a corrective statement for signature before close of business." HR's representative, a woman named Elise, who never met my eyes for more than a second, asked, "Admission language standard?" Nolan answered, "Standard plus acknowledgement of lapse under lead authority." He looked at me then, giving me the only choice he intended to allow. "Sign, and we can keep this internal." That was the public event, the second stage humiliation set not in a boardroom but in a corridor where people slowed down just enough to witness hierarchy enforcing itself. They heard the offer and they heard the condition. Their expressions shifted into that neutral attentiveness of employees watching consequences find a target. A technician I had trained last quarter stood by the copy room door with a stack of work orders and pretended to check page numbers while he listened. I felt the first words rise to my throat, felt their shape and speed, felt how quickly they would give him what he wanted. A conflict clip, an emotional outburst, proof that I was unstable under pressure. I swallowed them. I met his gaze and said only, "Please send all documents through formal review channels." Nolan's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "That would be unwise." "Document channels," I repeated. He shrugged for the audience, benevolent and burdened. "You are declining immediate mitigation." "I am requesting process." He gave a short, regretful nod, meant for witnesses. "Noted." He walked away toward executive elevators with operations at his shoulder, already speaking about containment timelines. The procurement visitor followed. HR lingered long enough to hand me a temporary grey lanyard stamped admin access, and then left without comment. The guard returned my old lanyard without the incident tab and cleared his throat, as if apology might violate policy. The outburst stayed inside me and hardened into method. I took the stairs down 6 floors to records because elevators make people chat, and I needed silence clean enough to think in. By 10:40, I was at the compliance archive door, where fluorescent light turned the metal shelving pale, and every sound arrived with documentary sharpness: the hum of a server rack, the soft drag of paper from a binder, the click of a lock cylinder resetting. Marta Vance, senior records clerk, looked up from her terminal when she saw the grey lanyard. Marta had been at Aegis longer than most vice presidents. She knew which documents were celebrated, which were buried, and which were quietly rewritten on Fridays. "You were stripped," she said, not as a question. "Temporarily," I said. Marta considered that, then reached below her desk and set a chain of custody ledger on the counter between us. "Temporary is a flexible word here. What do you need?" I placed my notebook beside the ledger and kept my voice even. "Requesting retrieval under Compliance Protocol 8.4, mirrored archive media for Bay 3 camera pathways, date range beginning 90 days before shutdown through today, with access logs and hash verification." Her eyes sharpened. "Those mirrors are sealed." "They are not prohibited." "No." She gave the smallest nod. "They are inconvenient." She rolled her chair to the side terminal, entered 2 credentials and waited for the system prompt. "Authorization? Incident lead of record, reassignment contested, legal exposure active." Marta looked back at me. "That will trigger notice to supervisory chain." It should. The printer beside her terminal woke and began feeding out a retrieval ticket. She tore it cleanly and passed it over. "Sign here. If this goes missing, it goes missing on paper first." I signed with timestamp 10:47. She stood, crossed to a locked cabinet, and returned with a black encrypted drive the size of a thumb, tagged with a red strip that read, "Bay 3 Mirror. Restricted." She set it on the counter, but did not release it until I placed my hand on the ledger. "To custodian transfer," she said. "State condition. Seal intact, tag intact, no visible tamper, transfer witnessed." "Witnessed," she echoed, and entered her initials. I slid the drive into a hard case and sealed it with evidence tape from the dispenser beside her monitor. My hands were steady now. Not calm from denial, calm from direction. Marta lowered her voice. "They will ask why you pulled this." "They already decided why. I am establishing what?" She almost smiled, though there was no humour in it. Good distinction. Where are you lodging it? Joint legal compliance intake with copy request to government audit liaison. That sends a signal. So did stripping my badge in a public corridor. She handed me a carbon copy of the retrieval form and tapped the timestamp line. Keep that dry, rain ruins ink faster than lies do. I left records with a sealed case against my palm and climbed back to the legal intake office, where frosted glass panels turn moving bodies into shapes without names. At the reception desk, I requested formal submission under dual receipt protocol. The coordinator took one look at the red tag visible through the case window and sat straighter. Do you have supervisory approval? I have protocol authorization and chain of custody witness. She opened her mouth, closed it, then said, Please wait. From behind the glass, I could hear Nolan's voice somewhere deeper in the suite, clipped and confident, discussing communication strategy. I sat in the waiting chair with the case on my knees and watched rain crawl down the outer windows in slow, parallel tracks. The urge to confront him one more time moved through me like static and dissipated against the hard edges of the sealed plastic. Anger would have made me loud, procedure made me legible. When the coordinator returned, she carried 2 forms and a barcode scanner. Joint intake approved, she said. Sign and state submission, purpose for record. I signed at 11:12 and spoke clearly enough for the desk microphone to capture every syllable. Submission of Mirrored Bay 3 surveillance archive and metadata for independent evidentiary review regarding shutdown causation and post-incident record integrity. She scanned the case, affixed a custody label, and placed it into a locked drawer with an electronic chirp. Received. That single word did more for me than any defense speech could have done in Nolan's conference room. Received meant entered. Entered meant traceable. Traceable meant he would no longer be the only narrator with a microphone. I rose, collected my receipt copies, and walked back into the fluorescent corridor carrying nothing visible in my hands for the first time that morning, because the part that mattered was finally where it could not be privately edited. The legal suite door closed behind me with a soft hydraulic sigh, and for a moment the corridor held only the hum of overhead lights and the distant rattle of a service cart rounding the far corner. My receipt copies were warm from the printer. I folded them once, precise at the centre, and slid them into the inner sleeve of my notebook. Across the glass I could see the executive elevator bank where Nolan had disappeared earlier, polished steel doors reflecting people in thin, vertical distortions. I stood there long enough to feel the shape of the morning settle into something I could carry without shaking, then turned toward the secondary stairwell because the main corridor ran past 3 conference rooms where my name had already been converted into a cautionary tale. On level 26, facilities had repurposed an old supplier suite into temporary admin stations. The place employees went when access changed, and no one wanted to say demotion out loud. The carpet was newer than the rest of the building and smelled faintly synthetic, as if it had not yet decided whether it belonged in a factory tower. My logins still worked there. My old project folders did not. The desktop opened to a restricted profile with only email policy archives and a form queue labelled Corrective Response Required. Nolan's message was at the top, time-stamped 11:19, subject line in neutral language that made coercion look like procedure alignment documentation for immediate closure. The body was 4 short paragraphs. He wrote that I had acknowledged lapses in escalation judgment, that I accepted temporary reassignment for organizational stability, and that signing by 1500 would prevent unnecessary external review. At the bottom he added, as if offering grace, I am still trying to protect your future here. That sentence was so familiar it almost made me tired. 5 years earlier, in a smaller conference room with warped blinds and a defective speakerphone, he had used nearly the same phrase after a supplier audit where I flagged a pressure seal anomaly on prototype housings. I could still see the room. Beige walls and a smear of dry erase marker that never washed clean from the board. I had prepared a 20-page variance packet, cross-referenced to test thresholds and acceptance criteria, and I had distributed it 2 hours before the meeting. Nolan arrived 10 minutes late, skimmed the cover page, and opened by saying, Harper has done her usual thorough documentation work, and I will summarize the practical implications. He stood while speaking, one hand on the chair back, and translated my findings into softer language that left procurement margins intact. When I said the defect required halt and hold, he smiled without looking at me and told the room, What she means is, we can monitor trends while preserving schedule confidence. The supplier representative thanked him for balanced leadership. Afterward, in the hallway, I told him he had reversed the recommendation in front of witnesses. He placed 2 fingers on my report and tapped once. "You are technically right," he said. "But technical right is not the same as organizational useful. I'm protecting your future here." 3 weeks later, the SEALs failed under stress test, and he called the corrective action his initiative. The cursor blinked in the response field on my screen, waiting for signature. I left it blank and opened Policy Archive 8.4 instead, then 11.2, then 14.1, building a cross-reference chain for formal reply. Outside the temporary suite, a pair of analysts walked past discussing lunch options in low voices, their tone careful when they passed my doorway, as if proximity to me could become part of somebody else's file. I recognized one of them from a client walkthrough I had designed and never attended. Nolan had excluded me that day with a line he delivered while checking his watch. "We need a concise external face. You stay and package support visuals." I stayed, polished the deck, and watched the meeting feed from a side monitor with no audio. On camera, I saw him stand in Bay 3, one arm out toward the lockout panel I had rebuilt after 2 near misses, explaining our architecture philosophy to a row of visitors in dark suits. He pointed directly at a risk matrix I had hand-labeled the night before. When one visitor asked who authored it, he answered without pause, "My team works as one voice." Later, he forwarded me a thank you note from the client with only 3 words in his own message above it: "Good support today." I printed Nolan's corrective statement, set it beside my notebook, and annotated every contested clause in the margin, each note tagged to a policy number. It was not dramatic work. It was exacting work. That had always been the difference between his method and mine. He sought momentum. I sought traceability. He needed witnesses to feel certainty. I needed records to survive scrutiny. By 11:42, I had drafted a formal non-admission response requesting preservation orders on all Bay 3 digital systems and restricted edit privileges on incident logs. I routed it to legal intake, copied compliance, and included the government audit liaison distribution address required under joint custody activation. I did not add commentary. Commentary is where people hide intent. My phone vibrated against the desk a minute later. Marta's name appeared, then her voice, low and brisk, when I answered. "Someone requested emergency access to sealed mirror metadata through supervisory override. Denied automatically because you filed joint intake first." She paused. "They are testing boundaries." "Who submitted the request?" I asked. "User credential masked at my level, but the authorization string originated from executive compliance block." She didn't need to say more. "I've printed the denial log and appended it to the retrieval ledger. You should request certified copy while it still exists. I'm coming down now." "Do not use main elevators," she said. "Nolan is holding court on 32. The line clicked off. 3 days earlier, before the shutdown, Nolan had gathered operations leads at Bay 3 for what he called a confidence reset after a missed production target. The command deck overlooked the floor through reinforced glass, and from that height the machinery looked almost orderly, each station aligned under white strip lighting, each worker movement reduced to geometry. I stood near the rear terminal with my tablet open to interlock diagnostics while he addressed the group. "Red status alerts have become too frequent," he said. "We are bleeding hours to caution." I answered that caution was not discretionary under current fault trend. The interlock had to hold until the sensor drift was resolved. He tilted his head as if indulging a lecture. "Real safety leadership enables throughput," he said. "It does not paralyze operations." 2 line managers looked away when he said it, not because they agreed, but because they understood which side of that sentence could cost them. At the end of the meeting, he told me to refine language in the risk memorandum. When I submitted the revision unchanged, his office returned it marked deferred pending management review. That unresolved memo was still in the system when Bay 3 went dark. By noon, I was back in records, and Marta already had a folder open on the counter, thin but decisive. Inside was the denial printout she had mentioned, system stamped 114613, showing an override attempt rejected under dual custody lock. She slid it toward me, then placed a second item beside it, a small anti-static pouch sealed with old tape, edges yellowed from years in storage. "This came up under your original architecture file when I pulled the denial chain," she said. "It is listed as implementation artifact, never checked out after commissioning." I looked at the label. B3 redundancy patch, hard token auth key. Author H. Lewis. For a moment the room narrowed to the pouch and the sound of fluorescent ballast buzzing above us. I had not seen that token since installation week, when Bay 3 still smelled like new conduit and solvent, when the camera system had not yet become politically inconvenient. I remembered the night clearly. Rain slamming the loading dock doors, 2 technicians on overtime, my hands cramped from terminating cable ends while I built a mirror pathway Nolan had called over-engineering. The token was a slim titanium key, no larger than a thumbnail, etched with a serial string and a notch pattern specific to the offline vault reader. Without it, metadata could be viewed in summary but not opened in raw frame sequence with audio sync. We had sealed it after commissioning because standard access was supposed to be enough. Standard access had not survived Nolan. Marta watched my face as I lifted the pouch. "If they claim the mirror cannot be authenticated," she said, "that object answers them." Why wasn't it pulled with the drive? "Because your retrieval request named media and logs. This was indexed under implementation collateral. Different branch." Her mouth tightened. "Branches are where inconvenient truth goes to wait." I signed a supplemental retrieval line, time 12:07, and stated condition allowed for the recorder. Seal aged, intact, no visible tamper, label legible. Marta countersigned and added her witness code. We sealed the pouch in a second evidence sleeve and attached a barcode that nested under the existing Bay 3 chain. The process took 4 minutes. It felt like reclaiming an artery. As I secured the sleeve in my case, another memory rose with the clean force of cold air. Installation week, after we completed the mirror test, I had walked Nolan through the architecture in the Bay 3 server alcove, concrete floor still dusty from construction. I explained that the redundancy path was isolated from routine admin controls and that the hardware token remained in compliance custody for exceptional review. He laughed once, short and dismissive. "You build for courtroom fantasies," he said. "We build aircraft." I answered that one day those might be the same room. He turned away before I finished and told operations to keep Harper on paperwork where she excels. He had not asked another question about the mirror after that. He simply assumed the system would stay quiet because I would. By the first week of October, I had stopped mistaking his dismissal for ignorance. Nolan understood systems well enough. What he discounted was consequence. He believed records were malleable as long as he reached them first. Marta handed me a certified copy request form for the override denial log. "Submit this today," she said. "If external counsel asks later, you want the copy timestamped before anyone starts housekeeping." "I know." She leaned both palms on the counter and lowered her voice. "You know this is bigger than your badge, right? If he touched post-incident logs after issuing attribution, this crosses into obstruction territory." "I know that too." Her eyes held mine for a beat, then she nodded once, an old clerk's version of solidarity. "Good. Then keep your language clean and your custody cleaner." I returned to legal intake by the interior route through procurement storage, where stacked crates muffled footfall and the air smelled of cardboard and machine oil. At the desk, the same coordinator from earlier scanned the new evidence sleeve and raised her brows at the label. "Additional item?" she asked. "Supplemental authentication key linked to submitted media," I said. She checked the protocol screen. "Requires notation of retrieval basis. Discovered through denial log trace under active chain." She typed, then slid the signature pad across. "State purpose." I spoke into the desk microphone with the same measured cadence I had used all morning. "Submission of hardware token required to validate raw mirrored Bay 3 footage and metadata integrity under joint custody review." "Received," she said again, and locked the sleeve below the counter with the first case. That word landed heavier now because it attached not just to what happened in Bay 3, but to the years when being correct in private had been treated as optional, while being agreeable in public had been treated as essential. I stepped away from the desk and stood by the frosted glass, watching blurred silhouettes move inside the suite. Voices low, phones lifted, documents changing hands. Somewhere in that haze was Nolan, still certain that control of a room could substitute for control of a record. I no longer needed him to underestimate me. He had already done the useful part. I opened my notebook to a clean page and wrote 3 lines. 1221 supplemental token submitted under chain. 1146 override attempt denied under dual custody. Pattern established across years. Narrative first, evidence second. Then I closed the cover and felt, for the first time since 9/14, that the building's weight had shifted by a measurable degree. Not toward mercy, not toward fairness, but toward proof. The shift lasted less than a breath before the next pressure found me. A legal assistant in a charcoal suit stepped out from the frosted corridor, scanned the badge at my collar, and held a tablet against her chest like a file that could bruise if dropped. "Ms. Lewis," she said, "joint compliance hearing has been accelerated to 1400 on the Bay 3 command deck. You are designated attending technical party." She paused, then added the part that mattered more than the invitation. "Observer status pending chair discretion." Her gaze moved to my notebook, then back to my face. "You should report to pre-brief room C in 20 minutes. I walked there by the interior bridge, above 2 production bays where gantry lights burned white against brushed steel. The bridge vibrated faintly under forklift movement, a steady mechanical tremor that rose through the soles of my boots and settled into my knees. Below me, people in anti-static coats moved in practice diagonals between stations, unaware that 1 floor above them, language was being arranged to decide whose account of Bay 3 would enter the permanent record. I passed the wall panel with client insignias and paused just long enough to check the time. 12:39. Then I kept moving. Room C had no windows, only a long mat table and a ceiling vent that clicked every 11 seconds like a metronome for institutional patients. Nolan was already there with 2 internal attorneys and Martin Hale from Operations Compliance, who had signed my quarterly controls report in August and now would not meet my eyes. A slim HR folder tabbed with Elise's initials sat at Nolan's elbow. My place card had been printed in smaller font than the others and set at the far corner, outside the arc of the main monitor. Nolan watched me notice it. "You can sit there," he said. "This pre-brief is strategy sensitive." I sat where he indicated and opened my notebook without comment. The senior attorney began outlining hearing flow, regulator intake statement, company response, evidentiary sequencing, then restricted technical clarification if necessary. Every term had cushioning built into it. If necessary, subject to time, at chair discretion. Nolan interrupted twice to emphasize reputational urgency, using the language of duty while redirecting the center of gravity toward himself. "We need a coherent voice," he said. "Fragmented technical narratives will be interpreted as internal contradiction." He turned slightly toward me without turning fully. "Harper, do not volunteer speculation. Legal will handle causation framing," I answered. "I do not speculate." He gave a thin smile meant to read as collegial. "Then we agree." The first slight arrived wrapped in procedure. The second arrived as logistics. When I asked for access to the command deck display console I had configured and validated, Martin cleared his throat and said, "IT has reassigned operator privileges to central response. We cannot risk unauthorized data injection." He said unauthorized as if the room had forgotten who wrote the authentication schema. I noted the phrase in my margin, then asked for read-only view of queued evidence manifests. The junior attorney shook her head before Nolan could speak. "Not until counsel vets scope. You are too close to your error profile on this incident." That sentence did not sting because it was cruel. It stung because it was efficient. I looked at her and kept my voice level. "My profile is not the issue. Chain integrity is," she replied. "Chain integrity is now legal property." Nolan tapped 2 fingers on the tabletop, pleased with how neatly the line closed around me. "Exactly. This is why we have counsel." By 13:10, they had moved from exclusion to inducement. Nolan slid a single-page corrective statement across the table, clipped to a yellow signature tab. "Sign this now," he said, low enough that the attorneys could pretend not to hear. "And I can recommend remediation instead of termination after the hearing." He angled the page so I could read the key clause in bold. I accept primary responsibility for Bay 3 shutdown mismanagement and related reporting confusion. He watched my eyes track the sentence. You will still have a career, he said. It just won't be in command. I let 3 seconds pass and pushed the page back the exact distance he had moved it toward me. I will not sign a false admission. He leaned closer, voice controlled, almost gentle. You are misreading the room. I am reading the record. Martin stood and busied himself with the coffee service to avoid being in the line of sight between us. The HR folder with Elise's initials remained closed beside Nolan's hand. The vent clicked again, then again. At 13:24, we moved to the command deck staging area, and the social choreography became public. Council and executives entered through the central door with badges pre-cleared for inner ring seating. I was directed to the side aisle behind the witness rail, where contractor observers usually stood. The seat tag with my name was gone. In its place was a laminated card, Technical Support Hold. I asked the marshal at the rail whether this was temporary. He checked his list and said, Instruction says you speak only if called by chair. His tone held no contempt, only policy fatigue. He had done this before, with other people reduced on paper before they were disproved in person. The command deck smelled of ozone, warm circuitry, and floor wax. Through the reinforced glass, Bay 3 sat silent under safety lights, yellow indicators blinking in patient intervals beside the interlock housing. The main display wall showed Aegis branding on one panel and hearing in progress on the other. 3 regulators took their seats at the centre bench, flanked by military procurement auditors and 2 external compliance counsels. A camera on a ceiling track rotated once and locked onto the table, every face adjusted to performance posture. A younger process engineer, one I had mentored through lockout drills last spring, stopped beside my rail position and spoke without fully turning toward me. I am sorry, he said quietly. They told us to route all technical questions through Nolan. They said your judgment is compromised by personal exposure. He swallowed and added, I know what you built in this bay. Then remember it accurately, I said. He gave a brief nod and moved away before anyone marked the exchange. When the hearing opened, the lead regulator recited scope with courtroom precision. Incident chronology, safety controls, managerial action, post-incident records. Nolan delivered the company statement in a voice designed for trust. He acknowledged process strain, praised rapid leadership containment, and positioned the failure as a misapplied judgment call at the technical level. He never raised his voice. He never looked in my direction for more than a passing fraction. The room rewarded his composure by following his sequence. A procurement attorney asked whether the unresolved risk memorandum had been managerially reviewed. Nolan answered, a draft note existed but did not meet escalation threshold. That was untrue, and he said it with the calm of a man who had practiced where to breathe. I requested permission to annotate factual discrepancy through the rail microphone. The marshal looked to internal counsel. Counsel shook her head once. Not at this stage, he told me. Nolan continued. To prevent recurrence, we reassigned technical documentation support and centralized authority under experienced supervisory leadership. A few pens moved. One regulator marked the margin of her packet and underlined centralized authority twice. 40 minutes can feel like an hour when you're watching your own work repurposed to authenticate your exclusion. I kept writing, timestamp by timestamp, each contested claim paired with corresponding evidence already under custody. 1347. Unresolved memo characterized as draft. 1352. False assertion of threshold deficiency. 1355. Role reduction reframed as preventive control. My hand never shook. My jaw did once when Nolan described my shutdown command as premature interruption inconsistent with production risk balancing. Production risk balancing was his phrase from 3 days before the event, spoken on this same deck when he wanted the line moving under red status. By the 3rd week of October, if anyone asked where trust failed inside Aegis, I could have answered with a map of rooms, not theories. The final segment began at 14:02, designated closing accountability remarks. Nolan stood at the centre lectern with the Bay 3 schematic behind him and delivered the sentence he intended to survive every transcript excerpt. The root cause was not malice, he said. but an individual lead's inability to align safety judgment with operational realities. He let the line settle. Then he added, "We have corrected that leadership gap." He was reaching for his water glass when the rear command door opened. The entry was quiet enough that only the marshal turned at first. A tall officer in dark service dress crossed the threshold with 2 audit staff behind him, each carrying sealed binders stamped Government Safety Oversight. The insignia at his shoulder identified him before his face did. Commander Ilya Grant, Lead Government Safety Auditor, former chair of the Joint Incident Review Board I had presented to 2 years earlier during the turbine interlock inquiry. He had the same measured gait I remembered from that hearing, neither rushed nor theatrical. The gait of someone who didn't need to borrow authority from volume. The regulator at centre rose slightly from her seat. "Commander Grant, we were informed you would join remotely." "I reviewed the remote packet," he said. It omitted live custody submissions filed at 11:12 and 12:21. His eyes shifted once across the table and found me at the rail. Recognition registered there, precise and unembellished, then returned to the bench. "I will participate in person." Nolan recovered quickly enough to sound cordial. "Commander, welcome. We have already provided a comprehensive internal chronology." Grant removed a pair of gloves, set them beside his binder, and answered without heat. "Comprehensive is a conclusion. We are not at conclusions." He took his seat, opened the top binder, and scanned a page marked with 3 red tabs. The room changed temperature without changing climate control. Counsel straightened. Martin stopped writing. Even the ceiling camera seemed to hold still. The lead regulator said, "Commander, do you request an amendment to sequence?" "I do," Grant replied, "for record integrity." Nolan stepped in before she could grant it. "With respect, the technical contributor in question has already been reassigned and is not our designated speaker." Grant turned his head toward him and spoke in the exact tone that ends debate by narrowing it. "For the record, Ms. Lewis authored the Bay 3 lockout architecture and filed the only unresolved risk memorandum on this unit prior to failure." He glanced to the clerk. "Read that back." The clerk did, word for word, into the microphone. Nolan's hand tightened around his glass. The base clicked against the wood once, then again. Grant continued, "I am requesting immediate evidentiary playback under joint custody rules from the mirrored Bay 3 archive submitted this morning, including raw frame sequence, synchronized audio fragments, access logs, and authentication via supplemental hardware token." He looked at the center regulator. "If this hearing is to produce a defensible record, Ms. Lewis must be recognized as technical source witness for her own architecture." No one spoke for 2 full seconds. Then the regulator nodded to the marshal. "Bring Ms. Lewis to the witness console." The marshal opened the railgate and stepped aside. I walked forward through the aisle they had kept clear for other people all afternoon, set my notebook beside the console I'd been denied, and placed both hands on the edge of the station until the clerk finished updating the speaking register. The monitor in front of me woke to custody authentication prompts. My name appeared on the active roster again, white text on a dark field. At 14:09, the room was no longer arguing about whether I should be heard. It was waiting for the record to open. I entered my credentials, then held out my hand for the evidence sleeve. The marshal broke the seal in view of the bench, passed me the titanium token with gloved fingers, and watched as I seated it into the console reader. A small green bar moved across the screen, slow and deliberate, verifying hash values against the joint intake receipts I had filed at 11:12 and 12:21. The clerk read each checksum aloud. The lead regulator repeated the final match for the transcript. In that room, certainty was no longer a posture. It was a sequence. Nolan leaned toward his attorney. "This is highly irregular," he said, low but not low enough. Commander Grant answered without looking at him. "Irregular is attributing fault before complete evidence review. Proceed, Miss Lewis." I selected Bay 3 mirror archive, raw frame sequence, synchronized audio, and access log overlay. The screen split into 4 panes: main floor camera, interlock panel close view, control audio waveform, and secure door log corridor. I set playback speed to 1:1. No dramatization, no slow motion, no editorial framing. I read the first timestamp into the microphone. 9:03:16 day of incident. Bay 3 interlock status red. Shutdown engaged. The footage showed the line stopped exactly as protocol required, yellow warning beacons pulsing against steel housings. 2 technicians stood at Station 3, hands clear, waiting for safety authorization. Then Nolan entered frame from the east catwalk, badge visible, headset on, jacket unzipped, moving with the brisk impatience he always called urgency. I heard his voice on the recovered audio, clean enough to remove ambiguity. "We are not burning another hour on this. Restart," a technician answered. "Interlock is still red, sir." Nolan stepped to the panel, keyed Supervisor override and said, "I have it. Bring it up." I did not comment. I advanced 5 seconds. The interlock indicator on pane 2 changed from red lockout to amber bypass, then to active rotation. Bay 3's spindle began moving. The senior external counsel rose halfway from his chair. "Pause." I paused. He looked at the overlay. "Can you confirm this is not simulation data?" "Yes," I said. "Mirror channel, hardware authenticated, uncompressed. Hash verified on record." The clerk confirmed. The lead regulator instructed, "Continue." I advanced to 090542. The same technician, now closer to Nolan, spoke again on audio. "Do we log forced restart under exception code?" Nolan's response came sharp and immediate. "Defer notation. We will clean the sequence after output stabilizes." No one wrote for a moment. Pens hovered. That was the first visible transfer of power in the room. Language that had been used all day to frame me now appeared in his own voice, attached to his own timing. Inside a system he had called compromised. I moved to the third required segment. 9:41:09 post-shutdown interval, I said. Secure log corridor. Pane 4 showed Nolan entering the records corridor outside the log room, alone, access badge raised. Overlay text stamped his credential ID beside the door event. He stayed inside 6 minutes and 14 seconds. At 9:47:31, he exited, took a call, and walked toward executive elevators. 5 minutes later, in the digital log pane, 2 incident entries changed from auto-locked to manager amended with a supervisory credential matching his ID. Internal counsel spoke first this time, voice flatter than before. "Freeze playback. Clerk, mark this section for immediate preservation order." Commander Grant closed his binder and looked to the bench. "This meets threshold for negligence review and potential obstruction referral. I request immediate privilege suspension for Mr. Price, pending formal findings." Nolan stood so quickly his chair legs scraped hard across the deck. "This is being misinterpreted. Supervisor override exists for continuity decisions. Everyone in this room knows that." Grant's tone did not rise. "Continuity authority does not extinguish interlock red status, nor does it authorize deferred notation." Nolan turned to the regulators, palms open as if reason alone had been denied him. "We had contractual pressure and incomplete diagnostics. I made a call in context. I answered only when the lead regulator asked me directly. Context was documented 3 days earlier in Unresolved Risk Memorandum RL77. It warned that forced restart under red could produce cascading fault and record integrity exposure if post-event edits occurred outside declared exception pathways. The procurement auditor to Grant's left asked, "Who authored RL77? I held his gaze. "I did," Grant added, "and she filed it as unresolved." By 1414, the room had stopped treating me as an accused technical party and started using my index references to navigate its own packets. I called up the memorandum, version chain intact, showing deferred pending management review under Nolan's approval route. Then I overlaid the hearing slide he had presented earlier that afternoon, claiming no qualifying escalation existed. The contradiction was not interpretive, it was architectural. The lead regulator spoke to the clerk. "Strike prior internal chronology as provisional. Replace with evidence-led sequence based on authenticated mirror archive and RL77 linkage." Then she looked at me. "Ms. Lewis, can you provide corrective pathway recommendations now, or do you require recess?" "I can provide them now." "Proceed." I gave 3 controls, concise and implementable. Hard separation of production authority from safety interlock override, immutable audit logging with external mirror verification at fixed intervals, and dual signature exception coding that prevented any single supervisor from deferring notation without automatic regulator alert. I named policy anchors, system owners, and deployment windows. No rhetoric, no victory speech. The room that had removed my name from the roster less than 5 hours earlier now waited for each line before moving to the next. When I finished, the senior counsel from Aegis, who had not addressed me directly once all day, said, "For corporate record, those recommendations are accepted pending board ratification." Grant corrected him. "Not pending. Interim adoption is appropriate today." The bench agreed. The Marshal logged implementation order at 14:17. That was the reversal, brief, public, and final enough that no one needed to announce it. Nolan remained standing beside his chair as if sitting would concede structure. Colour had drained from his face in uneven patches. The confidence he wore so easily in conference rooms now came in fragments, arriving late to his own sentences. He reached for his water glass, missed the stem the first time, caught it on the second, and drank without swallowing for a beat. Too long. The glass clicked against the table when he set it down. The sound carried. He tried once more. "I reject the implication of bad faith." No one answered him immediately. Silence, in that moment, was not indecision. It was reclassification. At a nod from the lead counsel, one HR/legal administrator from the second row stood with the folder that had waited unopened through pre-brief and placed it near his hand. "Mr. Price," she said, voice steady, "effective immediately. Your system privileges are suspended. You're placed on administrative removal pending termination for cause review under safety and records integrity policies." She paused, then completed the line with procedural mercy. "Security will escort you after acknowledgement." Nolan stared at her, then at the folder, then at the executives who had clustered around him that morning. None of them moved toward him now. One executive looked down at his own notes and kept looking down. "This is retaliatory," Nolan said, but the force had gone out of the word before it reached the far wall. The lead regulator spoke over him. "Regulatory referral is opened for negligence and obstruction assessment. You may submit counsel statement through formal channels. Do not address technical witnesses directly." He turned then finally toward me, and whatever expression he intended never fully formed. For years he had depended on one reliable mechanism. Speak first, define terms, let hierarchy harden around his version. The mechanism had failed in front of the one audience he trusted most, the audience of procedure. His jaw worked once as if he were about to deliver another managerial correction. Nothing followed. 3 minutes passed in administrative motion. Security arrived. Privilege lock confirmations appeared on the side monitor, one by one. Network access revoked, supervisory override disabled, incident log rights removed. The same infrastructure he had used to narrow my voice now narrowed his reach. By 1421, the command deck had entered that rare institutional quiet where everyone understands they are watching precedent, not theatre. The procurement auditors exchanged a glance that had no triumph in it, only recalculation. External counsel requested certified copies of the playback set. The clerk queued them. Marta's retrieval signatures were cited twice on record, each time with timestamp intact. Every thread I had carried in my notebook now had an outcome line attached. The lead regulator addressed the table. "Given demonstrated competence and prior authorship, this panel requests Ms. Lewis assume technical lead of the Bay 3 Corrective Action Task Force under joint oversight." Before I answered, Grant added one sentence. "That would align authority with accountability." I looked at the bench, then at the display where Bay 3's frozen frame still held Nolan's hand on the override panel. The old hunger for recognition from the wrong people had gone quiet in me. What remained was narrower and stronger. "I accept," I said, "on one condition. Reporting lines must be transparent and non-editable across safety, legal and external audit channels. No private amendments. No narrative substitutions." The lead regulator nodded. Condition entered and granted. Aegis senior counsel gave a curt assent, already writing implementation language that would have been called excessive last week and essential now. Security asked Nolan for his badge. He removed it slowly, placed it in the evidence tray, and signed the acknowledgement form with a hand that trembled once at the final stroke. He did not look at me again. The bench adjourned at 14:24. Chairs shifted back, files closed, the camera track disengaged with a soft motor whine. People stood in new constellations, drawn not to charisma, but to verified sequence. Grant remained seated long enough to sign the interim order, then rose and inclined his head toward me. A small professional gesture, rank recognizing record. As the room emptied, I packed my notebook, the same one that had held my first timestamp at 9:14:22 when I was told to sit down and disappear. The page I opened now held different entries. Playback authenticated, override confirmed, notation deferral captured, access tampering logged, privileges suspended, referrals opened, corrective authority reassigned. No adjectives. No plea for belief. I touched the edge of the console before stepping away, a habit from years of closing drills, and felt the metal cool under my palm. Then I walked out through the centre aisle they had kept from me at the start of the hearing, not faster, not slower, carrying nothing except the record that had finally learned to speak in its own name. The centre aisle doors closed behind me, and the command deck noise thinned into the muted mechanical hum of late shift. A legal intake liaison stood just past the threshold with 2 sealed envelopes in her hands. Posture formal, expression neutral in the way people choose when policy has replaced preference. She offered me one envelope and kept the other against her folder. "Administrative notice for your new assignment," she said, "and legal intake requests immediate chain reconciliation." She glanced toward the deck doors where security remained with Nolan out of sight. "His acknowledgement has been executed." I opened the envelope while we walked. Interim Technical Lead, Bay 3 Corrective Action Task Force, effective 14:30, Joint Oversight attached. The line beneath it mattered more than the title. Direct reporting channels immutable under shared audit control. No private edit rights. I read it twice to make sure the wording had survived contact with corporate language. It had. At 14:36, the legal intake coordinator met us at the counter with 2 locked drawers already open and a digital recorder waiting. The same frosted glass panels blurred movement inside the suite, but now every silhouette seemed to be carrying documents with both hands. She placed the black drive case on one mat, the evidence sleeve with the titanium token on another, and rotated the monitor so I could verify serials. "State identity and purpose," she said, microphone live. "Harper Lewis," I answered. "Chain reconciliation and custody transfer confirmation for Bay 3 mirrored archive media, supplemental hardware token, and associated metadata under joint hearing order." She read each barcode, each hash, each seal condition. Nothing rushed, nothing inferred. When she reached the denial log copy request Marta had urged me to file, she lifted a separate packet with a fresh certification stamp. "Override attempt denial report has been certified and attached to the primary evidentiary packet," she said. "Outcome? Preserved." She slid the packet toward me for visual confirmation and added, "You were right to request this before housekeeping windows." I signed where she pointed and watched the drawer locks cycle from local control to external oversight. Commander Grant entered during the final transfer check, set his cap on the counter edge, and reviewed the custody screen without greeting anyone first. That was his professionalism. Sequence before ceremony. Then he looked at me and gave a short nod. "Your retrieval timing prevented privilege contamination arguments," he said. "That was non-trivial work under pressure." He turned to the coordinator. "Mark both items unavailable for internal unilateral access pending referral processing." She entered the flag immediately. Marta arrived 3 minutes later with the ledger under her arm, glasses low on her nose, and the same unadorned steadiness she had offered me in records. She requested the recorder be left on and read her witness entries aloud. Original media transfer, 10:47, supplemental token transfer, 12:07, override denial preservation, 11:46, certified at 14:41. Then she placed a thin paper strip on the counter, old-fashioned carbon copy, and tapped my initials beside hers. "Paper still survives outages," she said to no one and everyone. "Chain complete." The coordinator appended it to the scanned file. When we stepped away from intake, a docket clerk was waiting near the hallway printer, revised agendas in his hands like a shield. He checked my badge, then passed me a stamped addendum receipt and a printed roster system extract. Clark Control received this as a formal filing, he said quietly. Source is the scheduling back-end archive, not discretionary notes. The screenshot showed a 914 change instruction issued from Nolan's terminal profile. Remove Harper Lewis speaking slot before evidence review. The submission trail was already signed, indexed, and attached to the hearing file. I read the timestamp twice, then handed the page back for packeting. Add it to chronology support, I said, not as a substitute for authenticated playback. It is already coded as corroborating exhibit, he replied. Primary record priority preserved. Good, I said. Record timing still matters. He nodded once and returned directly to Clark Control to complete the scan certification without looking over his shoulder. At 15:02, on the production floor command deck again, I convened the first corrective session under the interim order. The same reinforced glass looked out over Bay 3, still silent under lockout lamps, but the seating map had changed. My place was at the center console, not by the rail. The laminated technical support hold card was gone. In front of each participant sat identical binders labelled Corrective Action Record, and every binder contained the same document on top: transparent reporting architecture, 3-signature amendment rule, automatic external mirror replication schedule. The vice president who had said, "We need a single voice," sat on my left with his hands folded as before, except now he waited to be recognised before speaking. Martin Hale arrived last, carrying his own supplemental statement. He remained standing until I acknowledged him. "I need to correct the pre-brief record," he said. "At 1310, I supported denial of your console access. That position was not evidence-based." He placed the statement on the table. "I am submitting this to the file." "Submitted and noted," I said. "Take your seat." The process engineer who had apologised at the rail raised his hand next. I logged verbal instruction at Station 3. Defer notation. My shift notebook copy is available if needed. Provide it to Clark Control, I said. Cross-reference to audio at 090542. He nodded once, wrote the timestamp in his binder margin, and passed the notebook copy down the table. No one treated him like he had overstepped. That was another measurable shift. Not everyone who had watched me be diminished chose courage. The executive who had looked down when Nolan lost authority did not offer a statement. The procurement visitor from the corridor scene never contacted me at all. The technician by the copy room door who pretended to check page numbers sent nothing. Their silence entered the aftermath exactly as silence always enters. Not dramatic, but legible. At 15:40, Elise joined by secure link and read HR's formal disposition into the meeting record. Nolan Price. Employment terminated for cause under safety governance and records integrity provisions, effective immediately following administrative removal. System privileges remain revoked. External referral cooperation mandated. She paused for acknowledgement. "I gave it," she added. "Ms. Lewis, HR will require your signature on role transition protections and non-retaliation enforcement routing." "I will sign after legal verifies language parity with hearing order," I said. "Understood," she replied, and sent the packet. We spent the next hour building the corrective implementation grid, line by line, in real time, on a shared display no one could edit without trace. Hard interlock authority split from production command. Exception codes required dual safety signatures and automatic regulator notification. Mirror validation ran at fixed intervals with hash outputs sent to internal compliance, external audit, and records simultaneously. I assigned owners by function, not favour. When counsel asked whether we should allow temporary manual narrative summaries for executive briefings, I answered, "Summaries are allowed only as references to primary records. Primary records cannot be paraphrased into authority." Counsel tried to rephrase. I repeated the line. It stayed. By 1618, the city light beyond the glass had shifted from white to a colder grey blue, and the overhead fluorescence reflected off the table in long, clean bands. I asked for final confirmations on all open threads. Legal confirmed the drive and token were sealed in external joint vault with receipt numbers entered. Records confirmed the denial log certification and archival index placement. Clark Control confirmed the roster system screenshot extract and the process engineer's notebook extract were attached as corroborating exhibits, not substitutes. IT confirmed privilege locks and immutable logging were active. HR confirmed termination status and non-retaliation routing. No dangling items, no private folders, no verbal-only decisions. Commander Grant stayed through adjournment and signed the interim compliance affirmation beside my signature. As he capped his pen, he said, "Most failures start as technical drift and become cultural collapse when records bend. You prevented the second part." It was the closest thing to praise he had offered all day, and it carried weight because it was specific. After everyone left, I remained alone for a minute at the center console. Bay 3 sat below in disciplined stillness, warning lights pulsing at measured intervals across metal and glass. I opened my notebook to the first page from that morning and read the opening line I had written at 9:14:22, then turned page by page until I reached the last entry from this room. The notebook contained the whole arc now. Accusation, exclusion, retrieval, custody, authentication, reversal, corrective authority. No missing page, no rewritten margin. The guard at the elevator station met me with a small tray and an uncertain expression that resolved into respect as I approached. "Ms. Lewis," he said, "Credential Services asked me to issue this directly." On the tray sat a new red incident tab, reprinted and clipped to a fresh lanyard marked Technical Lead. He handed it over carefully as if plastic could carry memory. "Access has been restored across incident zones and command consoles." "Thank you," I said, and meant it. The elevator ride down was quiet, cables humming through the shaft, fluorescent light flattening my reflection in the doors, the way it had flattened everyone's upstairs. The difference was not in the light, it was in what no longer depended on it. In the lobby, polished stone held the last of the day's foot traffic, and the rain outside had narrowed to a fine, steady sheet against the glass. I stood there with my notebook under one arm and the new lanyard in my hand, feeling the old need for permission loosen for good. My name is Harper Lewis, and that was the day I stopped asking to be believed and started requiring the record to speak.